This is a really interesting week because the State of Nature report for Northern Ireland was published, and it revealed, as if we didn't know, that Northern Ireland is one of the most ecologically depleted countries, not in these islands, but in the entirety of the world. Given the other context, which is the ecological catastrophe unfolding, and just say a few words about the need for a just settlement for Lough Neagh. So I want to say a few words about Lough Neagh, past, present and future. And I think when we talk about Lough Neagh, we're talking not just about probably the richest ecological site in this island, but also a cultural jewel as well. You know, way back in mythology, the Tuatha Dé Danann are reckoned to have a fairy kingdom underneath the lough. The first settlers in Ireland came to Mount Sandal near Carrion, came down the Ban and settled around the periphery of Lough Neagh. There's really rich archaeology given the fact it's been settled from Mesolithic times. And even today around the lough, the lough itself supports so many communities of humankind. Clearly it was the major site for overwintering birds on these islands as well up until the 1980s. Lough Neagh held more wintering waterfowl than any other site in Britain and Ireland. So this is an ecological gem, it's a cultural paradise. And over the last 10 years, something has happened to it, and I can only attribute the malaise to phosphorus and to ammonia pollution, all part of the nitrogen cycle. The strategy that was implemented 10 years ago was falling on top of years of agricultural intensification. It was called Going for Growth. It was a unique strategy in Northern Ireland because it was one of the few strategies that was actually implemented. So all our strategies around anti-poverty, the need for peace and reconciliation, none of them were ever implemented. But this one was implemented in full. And just to give you an example in relation to pig numbers, it was suggested X thousands of breeding pigs could happen in Northern Ireland. That was the equivalent of putting 12 million people, a city the size of London, into Northern Ireland, but not give it any treatment to wastewater considerations. So basically we put a London into Northern Ireland, and this is only one aspect of the expansion of the livestock industry. And that one target, which was reached a few years ago, has meant that Northern Ireland is now suffocating in a soup of toxic pollution. So the Going for Growth strategy fell on top of many other strategies for agriculture intensification, and all this excrement was predictable. The reason why the government didn't want to carry out a strategic environmental assessment, which is what it was legally required to do, was because that predictability would have been known. So this is called FOFO, it's called fear of finding out. They basically have overridden all environmental laws, the Habitats Directive, the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, the impact of pollution into the Republic of Ireland, breaching the SPU Convention, and so it goes on. A litany of environmental crimes has taken place. So what we've seen is a breakdown in environmental law over many decades, but particularly in the last 10 years, because the last 10 years has seen Lough Neagh going into its death throes. That's why we're saying Lough Neagh is dying. That's why the communities around Lough Neagh last weekend had a wake for Lough Neagh. What do you do with all this ecological grief? Where do you go to? You know, when you consider Lough Neagh to be a living being, not a piece of property, not an asset, not a commodity to be exploited, but as a relative, as a neighbour, as an actual living being, the response from the communities was so touching and so incredibly poignant to say that we recognise Lough Neagh as a brother, a sister, a mother. We recognise that what's happening to her is a microcosm of what's happening to the planet itself. And the response from communities is really interesting. You know, people are basically saying we can't take any more from Lough Neagh. We need to develop a new relationship with Lough Neagh. The time for taking and extracting is over. The time is to make peace with Lough Neagh and have a just settlement. The Going for Growth strategy then has created a whole series of huge problems. The Lough Neagh fly, the keystone species for the entirety of that ecosystem has virtually disappeared in the last 2 years. If anybody remembers going to Lough Neagh 30 years ago, these plumes of millions of flies, you know, these are the larvae of the flies feed the diving duck populations. The fish populations feed on the life cycle of the fly as well. What's happened when the flies collapsed is that the pollen, this rare glacial relic, this freshwater herring, has also collapsed. Eels are collapsing, I know, all across Europe, but they've gone into a nosedive as well. The bird populations is chronic. We've lost well over 100,000 birds from Lough Neagh in the last 10 years. So if Lough Neagh was described as a person, it's a person that's on a life support system. It's got multiple organ failure. And it's not just the saturation of Lough Neagh with nutrients from primarily agriculture and intensification and then human sewage. The other problems are the damage caused to the fringe habitats. Lough Neagh and Lough Beg, the sister body at the northern end of the lough, supported the biggest numbers of breeding waders in Ireland. They have now gone into terminal decline. Even the small numbers of curlew that still survive, less than 10, are still being under massive attack from illegal peat extraction, particularly around the southern end of the lough. We have the biggest sand extraction business in the whole of Ireland. For 30 or 40 years this was operating unlawfully. The sand was being suction dredged and still is every day on Lough Neagh, and it's been sold to make concrete. So we're effectively turning this habitat into concrete. Now here's the really interesting thing. Lough Neagh is an area of special scientific interest. Lough Neagh is an area of mineral constraint. Lough Neagh is a Ramsar site, a site of global and international importance. Lough Neagh is also a European protected special protection area under the Birds Directive. All these designations mean absolutely nothing. What we've begun to realise is that the current model for environmental governance and management is failing, and maybe it was designed to fail. The only things that are being regulated at the minute, some people would argue, are the environmentalists themselves. We're not actually protecting Lough Neagh. These laws don't work. So we're in this really sad state of affairs. Looking to the future of Lough Neagh, I think we're going to places we never thought we'd go. We don't have a functioning government. The government created this problem in the first place. Who are you to blame for the dying of Lough Neagh? It has to be the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. For years, for decades, they've withered away any opportunities for effective management, governance and enforcement. Environmental laws don't apply to Lough Neagh. They are meant to apply. The rule of law is constantly broken, and that's why I would say the biggest environmental criminal in Northern Ireland is the state itself. I think Lough Neagh needs a recovery plan. I think people are beginning to talk about this. I think there's 3 elements to that plan. The first element is, for goodness sake, can we give this place a chance to breathe? Can we back off from the extraction? Can we back off from the pollution? Can we give it 3 or 4 years so we can establish an ecological baseline? Have the scientific community restore their limnology station at Trad Point or wherever else to carry out proper baseline research. I think also during this time of making peace with Lough Neagh, stopping the extraction, stopping the damage of the fringe wetland habitats, and most critically phasing out the pollution, we need to think about some type of truth commission, because the response from government was to deflect, was to dissemble, was to blame the factors that have put Lough Neagh into this chronic state of malaise on other things. Maybe they were exacerbating factors, but in the noise and in the confusion around Lough Neagh, they refused to do the very thing they were meant to do, which is to enforce environmental laws. So give the lough a chance to breathe for a few years, and in that time, start applying your responsibilities under the Water Framework Directive and Nitrates Directive. It would be amazing if the government officials did that one thing, simply abided by their rule of law. The second thing I think needs to happen to Lough Neagh is to explore other models of ownership. Currently, the bed of the lough is owned by the Earl of Shaftesbury, who lives in Dorset. He has explicitly said that the refurbishment of his Grade A listed building in Dorset was funded by the vandalism caused to Lough Neagh. This is someone who hasn't seen the contradiction in restoring a heritage project in England and ravaging the bed of Lough Neagh. This is an irreplaceable habitat. A Grade A listed building can be rebuilt by human beings. When you take away the bed of the lough, the invisible habitat because it's underwater, that's destroying the entire ecosystem. So I think we need to explore new models, and the model that a lot of people in the community are looking at is the idea of affording rights back to communities. You know, the state ownership model won't work either. These are the people who are ultimately culpable for the destruction of Lough Neagh. So the idea of divorcing the Earl and entering a new relationship with the state will not work, because private ownership and state ownership need to be balanced by other forces. So community ownership, I think, is probably the model, but who are the communities around Lough Neagh? It's not just humankind. It's the eels that come from the Sargasso Sea. It's the 5 or 6 great rivers that feed into Lough Neagh, and about 13% of the catchment is from the Republic of Ireland as well. It's the birds that come from Lake Mývatn in Iceland. It's the other species that have a huge global dimension. And Lough Neagh, in a way, doesn't belong to the government, it doesn't belong to the Earl of Shaftesbury, it belongs to all of us. So I think when we explore these new models of ownership and management and governance, we need to be thinking of restoring the idea that communities ultimately should own that lough. But the communities must be extended to non-humankind, and the idea of affording rights for the lough to own itself may have seemed far-fetched 10 years ago, but community ownership, not just humankind, I think is absolutely vital for what we would call an Earth jurisprudence approach to the future ownership of Lough Neagh. Everything in Lough Neagh has rights at the minute. A slurry tanker that's emptying its slurry today in Lough Neagh has rights. Someone who fires a gun at a flock of potsherd in the winter time, that gun has rights. The sand barges, the sand ships that are currently hoovering away the bed of the lough, they have rights. The owners of these companies have rights under corporate law and property law. The only thing that doesn't have rights at the minute to exist, to flourish and to be restored is the lough herself. I think the final thing that needs to happen, and it's beginning to happen, is to recognise when we're in a situation of no government and failed government, and they've let us down so badly, they've broken every environmental law, is go to where the power ultimately is, and that's within the grassroots. It's the grassroots who have stopped lignite mining in County Antrim. It's the grassroots who stopped fracking in Northern Ireland. It's the grassroots who will, I'm convinced, stop gold mining in the Sperrins. The grassroots who saved the place that I live close by, Strangford Lough, from desecration. So whilst we lose some campaigns, we win others, but this is the ultimate one. Lough Neagh is simply too special to leave to government, to leave to private ownership. And the model of community ownership backed up by community pressure is the only thing that will work, so that in the future that we learn to live with Lough Neagh instead of taking from Lough Neagh.